The biker tore a waitress's shirt in a packed bar, and the tear showed a small tattoo with VM mark tied to the most feared mafia boss in New Orleans. America so fast that the entire room went silent. People still talk about that night at the Brass Anchor, not because the bar was special, but because what happened there felt like a rule of the city was broken in front of everyone. The place sat on a wet corner street where old brick buildings leaned close together, and the windows always glowed yellow like they were trying to warm the whole block. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and fried food, and the music was loud enough to hide private talks. Men and women crowded the tables, laughing too hard, trying to look fearless, trying to look like the city couldn't touch them. But that was the funny part. New Orleans always touched people in the end. The waitress was Lila Marconi, and most customers never looked at her for longer than it took to order. She wore a plain black shirt, hair tied back, and shoes that made no sound on the floor. If you watched closely, you'd notice she moved with control, like she'd learned young not to spill anything and not to show nerves. Some nights she smiled, some nights she didn't, but she always did the job. She came from a large house outside the city, a house with iron gates and quiet hallways, but she didn't act like it. At the Brass Anchor, she was just another worker carrying trays and counting tips and dollars like everyone else. That night, the bar was louder than usual because a motorcycle group had come in after a long ride. Their jackets were wet from the rain, and the smell of gas clung to them like cologne. The loudest of them was a biker named Duke Harlan. He had broad shoulders, a thick beard, and a temper that seemed to wake up before he did. Earlier, in the back room, he'd lost $2,400 in a card game, and the loss sat on his tongue like poison. He kept tapping his fingers on the table, as if the table owed him money, too. Lila walked over with a drink and set it down in front of him. The glass clicked softly against the wood. She didn't flinch when he stared up at her like she was the reason his night had gone wrong. "You still owe for the last round," she said, calm and simple, not rude, not sweet, just a fact. The men around Duke snickered because they loved watching trouble begin, and a woman at the far end of the bar, Tessa Rowe, paused mid-sip as if she'd smelled smoke before the fire. Duke leaned back in his chair, smiling like he'd found a new way to feel big again. He tossed a few wrinkled bills onto the table, not enough, and he knew it. "That cover it?" he asked. His voice was thick, the way it gets when someone wants a fight but doesn't want to admit it. Lila looked at the money, then at him. "No," she said, still calm. "It doesn't." Her tone didn't change, but that was what made it sting. Duke wasn't used to being told no, not by anyone, and definitely not by someone he thought he could push. He stood up too fast, chair legs scraping the floor like a scream. In one quick move, he reached out and grabbed at her shirt, not to pull her closer gently, but to yank her down into his space, to show the whole room he could. The cloth tore with a sharp sound that cut through the music. For a split second, it looked like a stupid accident, the kind of thing a person might laugh off if they were decent. But the bar didn't laugh. Nobody laughed at all. The sound of the tear was followed by a strange silence, like even the air refused to move. Lila froze, not because she was scared, but because she knew exactly what the tear revealed. On the side of her ribs, just beneath the edge of the fabric, was a small tattoo, a crowned snake wrapped around a key, and under it the letters, VM. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't large. But it was clear enough, and the meaning of it traveled through the room faster than a rumor. Every regular in that bar knew what those letters stood for. They weren't just initials. They were a warning, a name tied to disappearances, payoffs, and whispers in dark hallways. Vincent Marconi. Duke's face changed as if someone had punched the breath out of him. His hand fell away from her as the skin had burned him. He stared at the tattoo, and the tough look in his eyes cracked wide open. His mouth opened, but no words came. He wasn't thinking about the torn shirt anymore. He was thinking about the kind of man who would answer that insult. And he suddenly understood he'd insulted the wrong person in the worst way, in public with witnesses. Across the room, the bartender, Caleb Morrow, stopped wiping the same glass and held it in midair. A couple of men who had been laughing minutes ago turned pale and looked down at their own hands like they wanted to pretend they weren't there. Tessa Rowe whispered, "That's his mark." And the whisper was enough to make other people hear it, because the silence was that deep. Chairs shifted. Throats swallowed. Someone's phone slid off a table and hit the floor, and the sound felt too loud. Then the apologies started, messy and quick, as if people could talk their way out of fear. "Miss, I didn't know," one man said, even though he hadn't touched her. Please, it was an accident, someone else added, even though it wasn't. We're sorry. We're sorry, came from a few mouths at once, like a prayer said too late. Duke finally found his voice, but it only came out in pieces. I didn't, he tried, shaking his head hard as if shaking could rewind time. Layla didn't yell, she didn't cry, she didn't curse. That was the part many people remembered most, because anger can be loud, but her anger was quiet and sharp. She pulled the torn fabric closed with one hand, covering the tattoo again, not because she was ashamed, but because it wasn't for them. Her eyes moved across the room, not begging, not pleading, just seeing each face clearly. In that look, people felt judged, and they deserved it. Duke reached out slightly, then stopped himself, afraid to touch the air around her. Lila cut him off with one cold look that said, "You already did enough." She turned, walked straight through the silent bar, and pushed the front door open into the rain. The streetlights made the wet pavement shine like glass. She didn't take anyone's apology with her. She left them standing there with their fear, their guilt, and the memory of a tattoo that proved the city had rules they had just broken. Vincent Marcone lived in a house people didn't drive past unless they had a reason. It sat on Magnolia Ridge Road, outside New Orleans, America, where the trees grew thick and the night felt heavier than it did in town. The gate was tall iron, black as coal, and it opened only after a camera above the stone pillar blinked twice. Past it, a long driveway curved through trimmed grass and bright lamps that made the yard look like daytime even at midnight. The house itself was wide and calm, white stone with dark shutters, the kind of place that looked peaceful until you noticed how many quiet men stood in the shadows. By sunrise after the bar incident, Vincent already knew. News like that didn't need to travel far. It moved through whispers, phone calls, and worried messengers who didn't want to be the last one to speak. A man named Owen Slate arrived while the sky was still pale. Owen wasn't a tough man, not like the people who acted for Vincent. He was a thin, nervous man who handled errands and paperwork, the kind of person who tried to stay invisible. That morning, he looked worse than usual. His hands trembled as he took off his wet coat, and his eyes kept flicking toward the stairs as if the house itself might judge him. They humiliated her, Owen said, voice rushing. In public. At the Brass Anchor. He didn't add extra details at first, because he didn't know how to say them without making it sound even more cruel. He swallowed and forced himself to continue. A biker grabbed her, tore her shirt. The tattoo showed. Everybody saw, then everybody got scared. Vincent didn't shout. He didn't slam a fist. He didn't curse. He only stood still near the kitchen window, watching the trees sway like slow water. That calm was what made Owen's stomach twist. Some men were loud when they were angry. Vincent wasn't. His anger arrived quietly and stayed longer. Where is she? Vincent asked. Owen cleared his throat. She didn't come back here. She left the bar and... she went somewhere else. No one knows where. She won't answer calls. Vincent nodded once, as if he'd expected that. He walked to the counter where a simple glass jar sat, half full of loose dollars. It looked harmless, almost normal, like something you'd see in any kitchen. Vincent touched the jar gently, then let his hand fall away. People said he kept it there to remind himself that money wasn't always clean. Others said he kept it there to remember what his daughter wanted, a plain life. Bring me everyone who touched her, Vincent said, still calm. Everyone who laughed. Everyone who stood there and watched. Owen's mouth went dry. Yes, sir. That night, cars rolled through New Orleans like a slow storm. Not loud, not fast, not screaming down streets. Just steady movement, dark vehicles turning corners without drama. Men knocked on doors and asked people to come with them. No shouting, no messy scenes. Workers from the Brass Anchor, rude customers, the manager, even a man who'd been too drunk to remember the details, one by one, they were picked up and driven out to Magnolia Ridge Road. Some people tried to argue, some cried, some begged. Most didn't fight because fear is a powerful thing when it becomes real. Duke Harlem was taken too. The tough look in his eyes was gone, replaced by something small and shaky. He didn't have his biker friends with him now. In the back seat, between two quiet men, he looked like he'd aged 10 years in one day. He kept repeating, I didn't know, but nobody answered him. Nobody argued with him either. The silence was its own punishment. When the cars arrived at the estate, the iron gate opened, and the line of vehicles moved up the drive under bright lamps. People stepped out and stared at the house. It was too clean, too quiet, too controlled. The night air smelled like wet grass and polished stone. A woman named Brenda Lott, one of the bar servers, began to sob softly as she climbed the steps. A man named Miles Renner, who'd been rude at the bar, tried to stand tall, but his knees shook. The manager, Gordon Pike, kept whispering that he'd done nothing wrong, but his own voice didn't believe him. They were led into a large living room with high ceilings and a fireplace that gave off steady heat. The furniture was expensive, but simple, as it didn't need to show off. The room felt like a courtroom without a judge's bench. People stood close together, not daring to touch the walls, not daring to sit. Vincent entered without drama. He wore a clean gray suit, no tie, no jewelry that flashed. His hair was neatly combed, and his face looked tired in a quiet way, like he'd carried heavy things too long. Two men stayed behind him near the doorway, arms crossed, eyes sharp. Vincent didn't look at the crowd first. He looked toward the stairs. After a moment, Lila Marcone appeared at the top landing. She hadn't slept much. Her hair was tied back, her face pale, and her eyes were hard. She wore a simple long-sleeve shirt now, but the way she held herself made it clear she wasn't hiding, she was protecting her own peace. She walked down slowly, not because she was afraid, but because she didn't want to rush into a room full of people who had already decided what she was worth. Vincent's gaze softened as she reached the last step. "I wanted you to have a normal life," he said, voice low enough that the room had to lean into it. "I wanted you to serve coffee, smile when you felt like it, and never carry my shadow." Lila didn't answer. Her arms stayed crossed. She stood beside him, but her body leaned away, like she didn't want the comfort that came too late. The room watched her with the kind of fear that turns into respect, and respect that turns into shame. Vincent stepped closer anyway and hugged her. It wasn't a showy hug. It was tight, almost desperate, like he was trying to keep a door from closing forever. His voice shook once, just once. "I'm sorry you got hurt because of me," he said. Some people in the room looked down. Others stared at the floor like it might open up and swallow them. Vincent turned to face them. The warmth of the fireplace did nothing to warm the air around him. "You all saw her as small," he said. "You thought a waitress had no power." He let the words sit. He didn't rush. He wanted them to feel it. Then he pointed to Gordon Pike, the manager. Gordon flinched so hard it was almost funny, if anyone had been in a mood to laugh. "You," Vincent said, voice steady, laughed when she asked for respect. "You treated her like she was nothing." Gordon's lips moved, but the words came out tangled. "Sir, I didn't know who she was, I swear." Vincent held up a hand. "That's the point," he said. "You should have respected her before you knew." He walked to a low table and placed an envelope on it. The sound was soft, but everyone heard it. $15,000, he said. For the staff who tried to help her and got pushed around for it, he didn't offer money to buy forgiveness. He offered it to correct something that could be corrected, even if it couldn't erase what happened. A few people blinked in surprise. They had expected violence. They had expected threats. They hadn't expected this kind of punishment, being forced to see themselves clearly, without excuses. Vincent's eyes moved to Duke Harlan. Duke swallowed hard, face gray. Vincent spoke to him almost gently, which somehow made it worse. "And you," he said, "will learn what it feels like to be afraid." Two guards stepped closer to Duke. Duke's knees bent as he might drop. He held his hands up, palms open, as if his body remembered the bar and wanted to undo it with empty gestures. "I didn't mean it," he whispered. "I swear I didn't mean to." Vincent raised one hand, stopping the guards. "No blood tonight," he said. "Just truth." One by one, the people from the bar apologized out loud. Some cried, some begged. Some spoke too fast, tripping over their words. Brenda Lott kept saying, "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry," like she could scrub the moment clean. Miles Renner couldn't even look at Lila. Gordon Pike tried to explain himself, but his excuses sounded thin in this quiet room. Layla finally spoke, her voice tight and sharp. "You're sorry because you're scared," she said. "Not because you understand." Her eyes moved across them like a slow light. "If I were just a waitress to you, you would have left me broken and walked away." No one answered her because there was nothing honest to say. Lila took one breath, then turned toward the stairs. She didn't wait for more apologies. She didn't accept the fear as respect. She walked up slowly, each step controlled, leaving everyone behind with the same emptiness they'd tried to fill with quick words. The fireplace crackled, the lamps outside shone, and in that rich, quiet house on Magnolia Ridge Road, the crowd learned the lesson they should have known in the first place. A person's dignity is not something you offer only when you're afraid. 2 days after the night on Magnolia Ridge Road, New Orleans, America woke up to the kind of quiet that usually came before something bad. The sky was gray, the streets were wet, and the city felt tense even in the daylight. People at coffee shops spoke more softly than normal. Shop owners watched the sidewalk like they expected trouble. Everyone had heard a version of what happened at the Brass Anchor, and everyone knew one simple truth. When Vincent Marconi was angry, the city usually paid for it. Vincent did the opposite of what people expected. He didn't send more cars through town, he didn't hunt for revenge. He didn't call in favors or make threats through other men. Instead, he got into a plain black sedan with no special plates and no men following behind him. He wore a simple coat and carried a thick folder under his arm, the kind you'd see a lawyer carry. His driver offered to come along, but Vincent shook his head. "No," he said. "I'm walking in alone." The driver stared as if he'd misheard. In Vincent's world, nobody walked into danger alone. But Vincent wasn't walking into danger. He was walking into an ending. The police headquarters downtown was a flat gray building that looked like it had been built to discourage hope. The front steps were worn, the windows were small, and the flag out front snapped in the cold wind like it was impatient. Vincent climbed the stairs without rushing. People passing by slowed down, not because they recognized his face, but because he carried himself like a man who wasn't afraid of anything. He pushed through the front doors, and the smell of old paper and disinfectant hit him at once. A desk officer looked up, ready to say something sharp, and then froze when he saw who it was. The officer's eyes flicked to Vincent's hands as if expecting a weapon. Vincent lifted the folder slightly. "I'm here to see someone," he said, steady and clear. Within moments the room changed. Phones stopped ringing for a second. A couple of cops turned their heads. The air tightened as a rope pulled too hard. A detective approached from the hallway, her steps quick but careful. Her name was Rowan Sloan, and her face carried that tired look of someone who'd spent years chasing men who always slipped away. She didn't act impressed. She didn't act scared either. Her eyes stayed narrow, like she was studying a trap. "Vincent Marconi," she said. "Why are you here?" Vincent set the folder on the counter between them. It landed with a heavy thud. "Because I'm done," he said. "And because my daughter is paying for my sins." His voice didn't shake. He looked tired, but it wasn't the tiredness of a man who needed sleep. It was the tiredness of a man who couldn't carry his life anymore. Rowan didn't touch the folder right away. "What's in there?" she asked. "The truth," Vincent said. "Names, places, dates, deals." He paused and added, "Enough to take apart everything I built." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small ring of keys. He set them beside the folder like they were nothing. "Storage unit," he said. "There's $5 million inside. It doesn't belong to me. Use it to pay back the people who got hurt." Rowan's mouth tightened. She finally opened the folder and flipped through the first pages. Her eyes moved fast, then slower, then fast again. Her face stayed controlled, but her hand stopped turning pages for a moment, as if she'd hit a name she never thought she'd see written down. "This ends you," she said quietly. "You know that." Vincent nodded once. "Good," he said. "Let it end." For a long second, Rowan just watched him, trying to find the trick. People like Vincent didn't surrender. They didn't confess. They didn't hand over money and names like a man giving away old clothes. Rowan had seen fear, lies, rage, and pride, but this felt different. This felt like regret, and regret was harder to fight because it didn't make noise. Rowan signaled to another officer. Papers were copied. Calls were made. Doors opened and closed. And through it all, Vincent sat in a chair against the wall like a man waiting for his number to be called. He didn't ask for water. He didn't ask for a lawyer. When Rowan returned and asked, "Are you pleading guilty?" he answered without thinking. "Yes," he said. "All of it." He didn't soften the truth. He didn't try to blame anyone else. He spoke like he was finally standing in full light. The news hit the city like thunder. In New Orleans, people argued on sidewalks and leaned into each other's faces outside corner stores. Some smiled because they'd hated Vincent for years. Some looked sick because they'd benefited from his shadow and now feared what would happen when the shadow disappeared. Old enemies celebrated in private. Old friends felt betrayed, as the ground had moved under their feet. By evening, every radio station was talking about it, and every bar had a different rumor about why he did it. Across town, in a small apartment above a laundromat, Leela heard the news in pieces. She had rented that place to breathe, to get away from iron gates and silent guards. Her friend Nina Hollis sat on the couch with a mug of tea, staring at the TV as it might suddenly change its mind. "He did it for you," Nina said softly, like saying it louder might break something. Layla stood by the window, watching cars pass, watching ordinary people live ordinary lives. Her face didn't brighten. Her shoulders didn't relax. "I didn't ask him to," she said. "I just asked to be treated like a person." Her voice was low, but it carried a painful truth. She wanted dignity, not a grand sacrifice that turned her pain into a public story. A week later, the courthouse steps were crowded. Cameras flashed. People shouted questions that Vincent didn't answer. He walked between officers without resistance, wearing plain cuffs, looking smaller than the legend had ever allowed. When the judge spoke the sentence, Vincent didn't react like a king falling. He reacted like a father accepting a prize. And when the heavy door of the holding cell closed behind him, the sound echoed down the hall like winter arriving, cold, final, and honest. A year later, the city's fear had cooled into memory, and the name Vincent Marconi didn't hit people's ears the way it used to. He walked out of jail without cameras waiting, without a crowd, without the old cars that once followed him like a moving wall. He didn't go back to Magnolia Ridge Road. He didn't even drive near it. Instead, he took a bus south and stepped into a smaller life in Savannah, America, where the air smelled like salt and pine, and the streets felt quieter than New Orleans ever did. The house he rented in Savannah wasn't a mansion. It was a modest place with peeling paint on the porch rail and a swing that squeaked every time the wind touched it. The yard was small, bordered by a simple fence, and the grass grew in uneven patches like it didn't care who lived there. Vincent liked it that way. He kept the lights low at night, not because he was hiding, but because he was learning how to live without needing to be seen. In the kitchen, he placed a clear jar on a shelf and dropped his first honest dollar inside it, then stared at it for a long moment as if it were the heaviest thing he'd ever held. He found work at a garage run by a patient woman named Harper Dean, who didn't ask him about his past as long as he showed up on time and kept his hands steady. The work was hard and plain. Some weeks he earned $120 a day, other weeks less when business slowed. He scrubbed oil from his fingernails and learned the quiet pride of fixing an old engine that didn't want to start. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't make anyone fear him. That was the point. At night, he came home tired in a clean way, the kind of tired that comes from effort instead of guilt. Lila came to Savannah in the early spring, when the mornings were cool and the afternoons warmed up fast. She didn't arrive with a hug ready. She arrived with careful eyes and a bag slung over her shoulder like she might leave again at any time. She had found a job at a small diner near the river called Moonlight Grill, where tourists ordered sweet tea and locals argued about baseball. She worked there because she wanted to, not because she needed to hide. She wanted a normal life on her own terms, even if normal still felt strange in her hands. Vincent tried not to push her. Some mornings, he made coffee and left a cup on the counter for her without saying anything. Some evenings, he sat on the porch swing alone and listened to the neighborhood sounds, dogs barking, kids laughing, a distant car radio trying to learn what peace sounded like. When Lila joined him, they didn't talk much at first. Silence between them had weight, but it wasn't cruel. It was the slow work of trust rebuilding itself. One afternoon, a knock came at the front door that didn't match the gentle rhythm of the neighborhood. It was firmer, like the hand was nervous but determined. Vincent stood from the porch swing, but Lila got to the door first, as if she needed to be the one to face whatever waited outside. When she opened it, Duke Harlan stood on the step with a hat in his hands. He looked thinner. His beard was shorter. The loud jacket and heavy chains were gone. His eyes were tired in a way that suggested he'd spent many nights staring at a ceiling, replaying one moment over and over. Behind him, a battered car sat at the curb, and the engine ticked softly as it cooled. "I found you," Duke said, voice rough, as if he hadn't used it kindly in a long time. He glanced past Lila and saw Vincent, then quickly looked back down. "I've been trying to say this the right way." Layla didn't move aside or invite him in. She stayed in the doorway like a guard, arms crossing without her even thinking about it. Duke swallowed and held out an envelope with both hands, like it might bite him if he wasn't careful. $2,400, he said. The money I owed, and $600 more. Not to buy forgiveness. Just to pay what I should have paid. Vincent didn't step forward. He didn't speak. He watched his daughter, letting her control the moment. That alone was a change so large it could have filled a whole room. Lila stared at the envelope, then at Duke. "You hurt me," she said, her words plain and sharp. "And you hurt me because you thought you could." Her voice didn't rise, but it landed hard. Duke's eyes watered, and he nodded like each word was a stone he deserved to carry. "I did," Duke said. "And I hate that man I was." He took a shaky breath. "I'm not asking you to forget. I'm not asking you to lie and say it was nothing. I couldn't keep living like I didn't do it." For a long second, only the porch swing squeaked in the wind. Lila's face didn't soften into a smile, but something in her eyes shifted, like she was choosing what kind of person she would be after pain. "I don't forgive you," she said. "Not today, maybe not ever. But I won't let that night own my life either." She took the envelope, turned, and handed it to Vincent. "Put it in the jar," she said, "not as a prize. As a reminder." Vincent's throat tightened. He nodded once, slow and real. "Yes," he said. "A reminder." He walked inside and placed the envelope beside the jar. Not in it yet, like even money needed to earn its place. When he returned, Duke was already stepping off the porch, wiping his face with the back of his hand. Layla watched him go, not with kindness, not with hate, but with something steadier: control. And in that small house in Savannah, as the sun lowered and the streetlights blinked on one by one, the biggest change wasn't that a powerful man had fallen. It was that a daughter stood in her own doorway, on her own ground, and decided what she would carry and what she would finally put down.